Human history is full of gaps, but the events of 1812 stand apart. This isn't just another date in the textbooks. It is a true watershed moment, a fateful boundary after which, essentially, all of modern civilization began. The global scale of those events touched different continents. In America, it is called the War of 1812. In Russia, the Patriotic War. And in Germany, the Battle of the Nations. But however historians name these conflicts, everyone agrees on one thing. The world changed beyond recognition. It would seem that such grandiose upheavals should have been immortalized in stone and bronze almost instantly to cement the memory of victories and tragedies for future generations. However, the architectural legacy dedicated to this period raises more questions than it answers. Some of the monuments look so alien, as if they stepped out of the pages of sci-fi novels about extraterrestrial civilizations, resembling dark dystopian alien outposts rather than classic 19th century war memorials. Here we encounter the first and most obvious inconsistency, an inexplicable gap in time. Human logic and historical experience suggest that monuments are built while the trail is hot, while emotions are strong and memory is fresh. As an example, it is enough to recall World War II. Immediately after the capitulation, as early as 1946, decisions were made to convert burial sites, and just 3 or 4 years later, large-scale memorial complexes opened across Europe. People did not wait half a century to honor the memory of the departed. They did it while witnesses and participants were still alive. The war passed, and the monument was built. This is the natural order of things. But in the case of the global conflict of 1812, the world plunged into a strange, century-long silence. The war ended. The winners were announced. Yet monumental construction, for some reason, did not begin a year later, nor 5 years later. The mass construction of iconic monuments dedicated to these events began only 50, or more often, 100 years after the end of hostilities. The peak of activity fell on 1912 and 1913. Imagine the absurdity of the situation. In a world where there is no radio, television, or internet, where the vast majority of the population is illiterate, and a majestic monument is the main and most accessible carrier of information, they decide to remember the great victory only a century later. This looks extremely suspicious and suggests that the official interpretation of the events of 1812 may not have been formed by eyewitnesses at all, but by ideologues of the early 20th century who urgently needed to create material evidence of long-past days. If we look at the timeline of memorializing major historical conflicts, a striking dissonance becomes obvious between the logic of the 20th century and what happened a century earlier. Let's take World War II as a clear example. Less than a year passed after the surrender of Germany before the Soviet military administration decided to convert military graves into full-fledged memorials. By May 1949, just 4 years after the end of the fighting, a grand military complex was solemnly opened in Treptow Park. This is a completely natural reaction of society and the state. While the participants are alive, while the pain of loss is acute and the joy of victory unites the nation, monuments are erected as visible confirmation of historical righteousness. No one waits half a century to erect a statue to heroes. It is done almost immediately in the immediate aftermath. However, regarding the War of 1812, which is called the Patriotic War and a fateful event, this understandable human logic, for some reason, stops working. Official history claims that the scale of those events was colossal, affecting the fate of entire states. But instead of majestic memorials erected in 1815 or 1820, we see a strange historical pause lasting a whole century. Monuments dedicated to the struggle against Napoleon began to be mass-designed and built only towards the Centennial Jubilee in 1912 to 1913. A legitimate question arises. Why, in the 19th century, in a world where telephones were absent, the telegraph was a rarity, and 80% of the population could neither read nor write, did rulers not use the most effective tool of propaganda? After all, in the absence of television and newspapers, it was the majestic monument in the city square that served as the main source of information about the greatness of the power and its victories. The absence of such structures in the first decades after the war looks not just illogical, but suspicious. One gets the impression that the Great Victory was either forgotten or that in the 19th century, this event was not given the significance that was attributed to it later. The situation looks as if someone in the early 20th century made a willful decision to update this topic, starting a large-scale campaign to restore memory. It was then, as if on command, that obelisks and temples in honor of events 100 years prior began to grow all over the world. But the most interesting part begins when we try to study those single structures that are officially dated to the 19th century. Upon detailed analysis, it turns out that even these rare witnesses of the past have a biography that looks, to put it mildly, rewritten. And their original purpose could have been completely different, having nothing to do with the War of 1812. A telling example of how the necessary historical picture was formed is the famous Triumphal Arch in Moscow. This structure is officially considered one of the main symbols of victory in the Patriotic War of 1812. According to the approved version, the monument was designed by the architect Osip Bove and erected in honor of the triumph of Russian arms. It would seem there can be no doubt here. A majestic monument stands in the center of the capital, and an appropriate commemorative inscription adorns it, stating that these triumphal gates were laid as a sign of the memory of the triumph of Russian warriors in 1814. However, if we turn to archival data and documentary evidence from the late 19th century, this sleek version begins to crumble before our eyes, exposing many uncomfortable questions. The first thing that catches the eye during an unbiased study of the object is its striking standardization. The design of the Moscow Arch painfully resembles similar structures scattered all over the globe. Characteristic winged creatures, chariots, and antique decor are present on triumphal gates in Italy, France, and even in completely unexpected places such as Africa or India. One gets the impression that we are dealing with a kind of typical global architectural project of that era, a franchise of the antique style that was simply adapted to local needs, and not a unique monument of national glory. In documents from 1883, this structure appears simply as triumphal gates, without a rigid link to a specific date or war, which in itself causes bewilderment. The situation becomes even more intriguing when it comes to those very commemorative inscriptions that today serve as the main proof of the arch's dedication to the events of 1812. On old archival images, it is clearly visible that the text on the plaques is either completely absent, completely unreadable, or was intentionally destroyed by time and people. That is, throughout the 19th century, the main evidence of the gate's involvement in the war with Napoleon was virtually absent. Clarity appeared only in the early 20th century. It was in 1912, as part of the large-scale preparations for the celebration of the centenary of the Battle of Borodino, that the arch underwent a major restoration. During these works, the facade was cleaned so thoroughly that, apparently, they removed the remnants of any original information, if it was there at all, and hung brand new, sparkling plaques with the necessary ideological text. It turns out that we know about the true purpose of this structure exclusively from the words of 20th century historians who styled the monument for the Jubilee date. Until 1912, the arch stood nameless or carried a different meaning that was erased for the sake of creating a patriotic myth. One could write this off as a peculiarity of the domestic approach to preserving history, where facts are often adjusted to the political climate, and assume that in pedantic Europe things are different. After all, German neatness and love of order are legendary. However, transporting ourselves to Germany, we discovered that the situation with monuments of that era looks even more confusing and mystical there than in Russia. Moving from the Moscow archives to the heart of Europe, we have the right to expect German pedantry and precision in matters of preserving historical memory. However, Germany presents researchers with a surprise that surpasses even the story of the Triumphal Arch in its mystery. We are talking about the grandiose memorial complex known as the Hall of Liberation. This majestic structure, located on top of Mount Michelsberg, is officially dated to 1863. It is believed that it was erected on the initiative of King Ludwig I and designed by the famous architect Leo von Klenze for the 50th anniversary of the Battle of the Nations near Leipzig. The architecture of the complex itself boggles the imagination. A huge cylinder 60 meters high, topped with a dome and decorated with giant statues symbolizing the 18 tribes, the progenitors of the German nation. The scale of construction indicates the exceptional importance of the event to which it is dedicated. But one only has to step away from the guidebooks and turn directly to the stone itself, and the sleek historical concept begins to blur. Official historiography categorically states, the memorial is dedicated to the victory in the anti-Napoleonic Wars of 1813 to 1814. It would be logical to expect to see on the walls the dates of battles, the names of commanders, or at least a mention of the defeated enemy, France or Napoleon Bonaparte himself. However, neither inside nor outside of this cyclopean complex is there a single concrete indication of the events of the early 19th century. The inscriptions carved in marble are discouragingly abstract and philosophical in nature. The text on the marble floor of the hall reads, "May you never forget what made the liberation struggle necessary and how it resulted in victory." The phrase sounds solemn, but it is absolutely faceless. What specific struggle are we talking about? From whom were these tribes liberating themselves? When did this happen? The stone is silent. Another key inscription, located above the entrance portal, is dedicated to the German liberators and King Ludwig I. There are discrepancies in the translation, either "to the German liberators" or "to the fighter for liberation," but the essence remains unchanged. Chronological references are completely absent from the text. Neither 1813 nor Battle of the Nations appear there. A paradoxical situation arises. In a beautiful place stands a huge, expensive memorial, the true purpose of which is impossible to determine from the inscriptions. There is a strong impression that we are observing not a monument to a specific war, but a kind of universal structure to which a convenient historical meaning was assigned retroactively. Specially trained people simply appointed this temple as a monument to the War of 1813, although its architecture and epigraphy contain no confirmation of this version. This suggests that in the 19th century there was a completely different tradition of erecting monuments, or we are dealing with a global rewriting of the purpose of existing objects. This strange trend, building or repurposing giant complexes decades after the events, is not a local German phenomenon. If we return to Russia and look at the most important sacred structure supposedly dedicated to the victory over Napoleon, the Cathedral of Christ the Savior, we will discover that its real construction history diverges even more dramatically from the official dates, completely breaking the usual chronology of memory. The largest and perhaps the most controversial link in the chain of strange memorials is the Cathedral of Christ the Savior in Moscow. In official historiography, this colossal cathedral is presented without alternative as the main monument to the patriotic war of 1812, a symbol of the Russian people's gratitude for salvation from the Napoleonic invasion. It would seem that everything here should be extremely clear and documented because we are talking about the sacred center of the empire. However, when comparing dates and studying the real chronology of construction, a picture opens up that completely destroys the usual perception of time. Officially, the temple was built for decades and was consecrated in 1883, already 70 years after the expulsion of the enemy, which in itself is a huge period for a victory monument. But even this date raises doubts if we turn to objective evidence from the early 20th century. There are documentary confirmations dating back to 1907 in which it is clearly visible that work on the exterior decoration of the cathedral was still not completed. The building, which was supposed to become a symbol of triumph back in the 19th century, in the early 20th century actually still represented an unfinished construction site. This means that the temple in its finished canonical form opened for believers and patriots practically by the centennial jubilee of the war. An incredible situation arises. The main monuments designed to immortalize the events of 1812 are being finished and put into operation a century after the events themselves. It is as if monuments to World War II began to open en masse only in the middle of the 21st century. Such a delay defies logical explanation if viewed within the framework of traditional historical memory. All these facts inexorably lead to the conclusion that it was the turn of 1912 to 1913 that became the starting point for a new historical paradigm. For some unknown reason, it was in the early 20th century that a powerful state machine was launched to propagate and update the history of the war with Napoleon. An active information campaign began. Nameless triumphal arches were urgently assigned heroic names, hanging new plaques with the necessary dates on them. Long-term construction projects that had stood for decades were completed in an emergency mode, adjusting their opening to the round date. German memorials with vague meanings were attributed to specific anti-Napoleonic victories. History was being created here and now, before the eyes of the astonished public, and the century-long silence was filled with the noise of solemn openings. However, when history is written or rewritten in a hurry, 100 years after the real events, mishaps and semantic errors are inevitable. Ideologues of the early 20th century, striving to create a majestic pantheon of victory, sometimes did not notice that the symbols they used carried a completely different meaning. In pursuit of scale, they missed details that, upon careful examination, turn patriotic monuments into something ambiguous, and sometimes, frankly treacherous in relation to the official version of victory. Some of these monuments, solemnly opened in 1912 to 1913, contain such flagrant contradictions that they force us to doubt. Is it really that war and those winners that they are actually glorifying? Among the many monuments solemnly opened in the Jubilee year of 1913, the monument in Smolensk, opened on September 10th, deserves special attention. Officially, this sculptural composition is interpreted extremely patriotically. At the top of a cliff, two mighty eagles, symbolizing the united Russian armies of Bagration and Barclay de Tolly, protect their nest from a Gaul in armor climbing up. The Gaul personifies the Napoleonic army, and the plot is intended to show the impregnability of Russian strongholds. However, a deeper cultural analysis reveals an ancient European legend that turns the meaning of the composition upside down. According to Gallic legends, a young warrior, in order to prove his valor and become a man, was obliged to perform a daring feat: climb a high rock and steal an egg from an eagle's nest. If we view the monument through the prism of this myth, then before us is not the humiliation of the enemy, but the glorification of his insane bravery. It turns out that in 1913, a monument was erected in a Russian city that can be interpreted as an ode to the valor of a French soldier who challenged the elements. The fate of this monument in the Soviet era adds even more mystery to the story. In 1917, the new government, known for its fight against imperial symbols, behaved extremely illogically. A bronze map of Russia with the inscription, "Grateful Russia to the Heroes of 1812, was dismantled from the monument. But the double-headed eagles themselves, the main symbol of autocracy, were for some reason left untouched. If the Bolsheviks needed non-ferrous metal, they would have sent the massive bronze figures of birds and heavy wreaths to be melted down. But only the map disappeared. This suggests that the issue was not the material, but the information depicted on this map. Perhaps the borders of states, or geography itself on it, did not correspond to the version of history that began to be established in the 20th century. The map was returned to its place only in the 50s, probably already in a corrected form. An even more flagrant historical dissonance can be found in Tsarskoye Selo, where there are cast iron gates installed supposedly back in 1817. The monument bears the touching name, "To my dear comrades in arms," and is dedicated to the victory in the Patriotic War. At first glance, there is nothing seditious here. The emperor thanks the army. But the devil is in the details of the placement of the inscriptions. The text in Russian, addressed to his own soldiers, is placed on the inner side of the gates, that is, essentially, in the backyard. But on the grand front side, which everyone approaching the triumphal arch sees, the exact same phrase is embossed in French. This creates an absurd situation that has no analogues in the world practice of memorials. Imagine a monument to Soviet soldiers in Berlin, on the facade of which the main congratulatory inscription is made in German. This is unthinkable. In the history of wars, the winner never immortalizes his triumph in the language of the defeated aggressor, and certainly not in the most prominent place. The fact that the face of the monument speaks French makes one wonder, who actually dictated the terms of peace, and who was the true beneficiary of that war? Either the elites of that time were so integrated into Western culture that they neglected their own people, or the very essence of the conflict was completely different. To sort out this chaos of meanings, it is necessary to turn our gaze to the personality of the man who designed the key buildings of that era in Russia and Germany. His work is saturated with such a strange aesthetic, as if he drew inspiration from another reality, or saw a future inaccessible to his contemporaries. The figure linking the architectural oddities of Germany and Russia deserves separate and close attention. We are speaking of the brilliant German architect Leo von Klenze, a man whose work defined the appearance of many European cities, but at the same time left behind a trail of insoluble riddles. He is credited with creating the most mystical structures on German soil, such as Valhalla near Regensburg, an exact copy of the Greek Parthenon arising in the middle of the Bavarian forests, or the Glyptothek and Propylaea in Munich. Looking at his works, there is a persistent feeling that this master did not live in the 19th century, but was teleported straight from deep antiquity. Everything his hand touched instantly turned into majestic decorations of the ancient world, absolutely ignoring the realities of the era in which he created. However, Klenze's influence was not limited to German lands. He made a colossal contribution to the architectural appearance of St. Petersburg by designing the new Hermitage building, with its famous portico and Atlanteans. It would seem that an architect of this level, who personally visited the Russian capital and worked by order of the emperor, should have been well versed in the cultural codes and traditions of the country for which he was building. But here we encounter an artifact that literally blows the mind of any researcher. There is a sketch project developed by Leo von Klenze, which he himself called Russian Church. It would be logical to expect to see onion domes, crosses, and characteristic Byzantine or Old Russian plasticity on the drawings. But what the German architect proposed has nothing to do with Orthodoxy or Christianity in general. The design of this church looks like a futuristic object from science fiction. It is a complex engineering structure resembling a technical hub, a power station, or a spaceport terminal rather than a house of prayer. The geometry of forms, proportions, and the general silhouette, all this evokes associations with high technologies or alien architecture, but not with church architecture of the 19th century. How could a man who walked along Nevsky Prospect and saw the Kazan and St. Isaac's cathedrals propose to the customer something so alien? Or perhaps, in his reality, Russian style looked exactly like that? This sketch looks like a memory from the future, when the concept of traditional religion had not yet formed, or, conversely, like an echo of a highly developed civilization of the past, whose functional buildings later began to be perceived as cult objects. Klenze seemed not to know what Russia should look like, and offered his own technocratic version, which remained on paper, rejected by the Conservative Council. But if von Klenze's paper fantasies can still be written off as a creative search or the eccentricity of a genius, then the ideas of German builders of the early 20th century materialized in concrete and stone cannot be ignored. What they erected in Leipzig for the centennial jubilee of the Battle of the Nations goes beyond any architectural style and common sense. If Klenze's sketches simply surprise, then this realized project causes instinctive awe and a feeling of touching something completely non-human. This structure stands out so much from the usual picture of the world that it is difficult to call it a monument in the usual sense of the word. The culmination of the entire chain of historical and architectural oddities associated with the events of a century ago is undoubtedly the monument erected in Leipzig, Germany. This colossus, solemnly opened in that same significant year of 1913, is officially called the Monument to the Battle of the Nations. However, at the first glance at this structure, any associations with classical architecture of the 19th or early 20th century instantly evaporate. Before the viewer appears not a graceful obelisk and not a triumphal arch, but a gloomy mountain of concrete and stone, suppressing with its power, 91 meters high. With its outlines, this dark ziggurat resembles rather a fortified bunker of an ancient civilization, or, if you like, an alien base from the dark cinematic universe of Aliens, rather than a memorial in honor of cavalry charges and cannon volleys. The exterior of the monument causes anxiety, but what is hidden inside its massive walls plunges one into real shock. The interiors of the complex look like sets for a high-budget sci-fi movie about contact with extraterrestrial intelligence. Huge statues of guardians, devoid of human emotions, lined up in a circle around the dome, gaze at visitors with frightening indifference. Sculptural groups allegorically depicting people's strength, or the strength of faith, represent strange scenes where small human figures trustingly press against giant, non-human entities. But the most mystical element is the so-called crypt with a warrior. This room evokes direct visual parallels with shots from Ridley Scott's film Prometheus. The stone figure lying in the center of the hall and the masks of guardians surrounding it look incredibly modern and technological, as if this is not a tribute to soldiers of the past, but a stasis chamber for travelers between worlds. It is hard to believe that such an aesthetic could be born in the head of an artist in 1913 without the influence of images that would become understandable to humanity only a century later. The semantic content of this gloomy temple raises no fewer questions than its visual imagery. The name, Monument to the Battle of the Nations, sounds like evil irony if recall the real historical context of the battle near Leipzig. Official history states that in that battle, Germans fought on both sides of the front. Saxon troops supported Napoleon, while Prussia and Austria opposed him. In essence, on the fields near Leipzig, the German nation was engaged in self-destruction. Brother killed brother. And in honor of this bloody feud, where the nation was split, a cyclopean monument is erected, glorifying unity and power. To whom is this necropolis actually dedicated? What nations or entities did the creators have in mind when designing this Hall of Eternity, looking more like a temple of forgotten gods than a memorial of military glory. This entire grandiose construction, saturated with the symbolism of death and rebirth, seems completely alien to human history of the early 20th century. It stands out from the general row, screaming about its different origin or different purpose. If we put all the details together, from Moscow's long-term construction projects to the Leipzig Colossus, from rewritten plaques on triumphal arches to strange dates of monument openings, a frightening and consistent picture begins to emerge before us. It seems that behind the lush facades of the Jubilees of 1912 to 1913, they tried to hide something global from us, replacing the real memory of a catastrophe with a beautiful but hastily composed legend. Gathering all the scattered fragments of this historical puzzle, we inevitably arrive at a single denominator, which, like an invisible director, managed the scenery of the past. This denominator is the year 1912. It is this date that becomes the key assembly point for all official historiography of the 19th century. All the oddities, inconsistencies, and architectural anomalies we examined, from the refaced triumphal arches in Moscow to the mystical concrete ziggurats in Leipzig, cease to seem like accidental errors if we look at them as elements of a single, global plan. There is a strong impression that it was in the early 20th century that a gigantic flywheel was launched to create the correct memory. The world elites of that time seemed to suddenly remember and, in a unified impulse, began a massive campaign to legitimize the events of a century ago, creating material evidence where there was none, or changing the meaning of existing objects. This process resembled a grandiose theatrical production, where the scenery was erected right before the actors walked out. Nameless antique gates standing all over the world were urgently given biographies and hung with plaques bearing the names of the necessary commanders. Long-term construction projects that had been an eyesore to citizens for decades were completed in a rush, adjusting the completion dates to a beautiful jubilee. Strange, technologically complex structures whose true purpose was forgotten or lost were assigned the status of memorials, although their appearance and internal energy contradicted any logic of military memory. The year 1912 became that very paper screen that fenced off the real past, replacing it with a beautiful but artificial myth about the War of 12. Why was it necessary to wait a whole century? The answer is cynical but simple. Time is the falsifier's best ally. By 1912, not only the participants in those events were guaranteed to be gone, but also their children and even their grandchildren, who could have heard the truth firsthand. No witnesses remained. The field for creativity became absolutely clean. In the absence of living memory, history could be rewritten from scratch, adjusting facts to the political needs of new empires. Perhaps behind the magnificent celebrations of the Victory Jubilee, they hid the consequences of a certain global catastrophe of the 19th century, about which we are forbidden to know. That very catastrophe which destroyed the old world, leaving behind ruins, buried cities, and strange, non-human structures that were later called monuments. Thus, the history of the War of 1812, in the form in which we know it, is, apparently, a high-quality information product, a new construct of the early 20th century. We were presented with a romanticized version of events, with hussars and balls, to hide behind it something much more terrible and grandiose. We live in a reality constructed 100 years ago, and we accept as historical truths what was written in the offices of ideologues on the eve of World War I. And the silent granite and concrete colossi scattered across Europe and Russia continue to keep their secrets, remaining the only witnesses, albeit renamed ones, of what actually happened.